On Christmas Eve, 35 floors above the city, my son screamed that I needed to pay rent like a normal adult or get out. The room went silent, except for the clinking of silver forks against china. He had no idea that the penthouse he was standing in, the luxury car in the garage, and the credit card his wife was using all belonged to me. I had been silent for 20 years, but tonight, I decided to evict him from his fantasy. My name is Eleanor Hart. I am 63 years old, and as I carried the 20-pound turkey from the double ovens to the dining table, my arms trembled not from age, but from a rage I had suppressed for 2 decades. The penthouse at Riverfront Heights was suffocatingly warm, filled with the scent of rosemary and expensive perfume. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the city lights below looked like cold, indifferent stars. There were about 25 people crowded into the dining area. They were mostly colleagues of my son or wealthy friends of my daughter-in-law, with a few distant relatives scattered in between. They held crystal goblets filled with imported Cabernet, their laughter bouncing off the high ceilings. I weaved through them like a ghost in my own property. I set the heavy platter down on the trivets. Steam curled up, dampening the loose strands of grey hair escaping my bun. A cousin of Bella's, a woman with too much filler in her lips, chuckled as she watched me wipe a smudge of grease from the table. "Eleanor, you really are a wonder," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. 60-something, and you can still play housekeeper all day. I would be exhausted. I forced a smile, my hands gripping the back of a chair to steady myself. "It keeps me busy," I said softly. My son, Lucas Hart, sat at the head of the table. He looked immaculate in a white dress shirt that cost more than my first car. He checked his gold watch, ensuring the attention was on him. "It is not easy securing a lease in the Heights," Lucas announced to the table, gesturing expansively at the view. "The vetting process is brutal. But with my promotion to senior architect, the salary covers the rent and the lifestyle. We like to keep things top tier." Next to him, his wife, Bella, was already broadcasting to her followers. She held her phone up, the ring light reflecting in her eyes. "Merry Christmas." Everyone, she chirped at the screen. "Just showing off our little feast. The heating bill and the garage fees for the new electric SUV are killing us. But hey, Lucas and I handle it all ourselves. Independent living. Right. No handouts here." The guests nodded appreciatively. The conversation drifted toward the housing market and the burden of elderly dependents. I stood by the open kitchen, clutching a serving spoon, feeling the cold marble of the counter press against my hip. I was a statue in a room full of moving parts. Then, Lucas placed his linen napkin on the table. The sound was soft, but it cut through the chatter. "Speaking of housing costs," he said, his voice projecting clearly. He turned in his chair to face me. The room fell silent. "Mum, we need to be realistic. If you want to continue living in the guest room, starting next month, you need to pay market rate for your room, pay rent like a normal adult, or find somewhere else to live." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. A few guests looked down at their plates, but I saw Bella smirk behind her wineglass. Someone at the far end of the table stifled a giggle. No one spoke up. No one asked him how he could speak to his mother that way. I could hear the second hand of the wall clock clicking. Click, click, click. I slowly placed the silver spoon onto the ceramic rest. I untied my apron, the knot slipping loose with a whisper. My knees cracked audibly as I straightened my back. "This is probably the last Christmas I will eat dinner in this apartment," I said, my voice steady and low. "Thank you all for coming." Lucas frowned, clearly annoyed that I had not simply nodded in submission. "Mom, do not be dramatic." I looked him dead in the eye. "I am not being dramatic." "Lucas," I said, "I am just making space for the people who can afford to be here." I turned my back on the feast I had cooked. I walked past the stunned faces, down the hallway to the small guest bedroom. I closed the door. The latch clicked into place, a small sound that echoed in my mind like the slamming of a heavy iron gate, sealing off a lifetime of silence. Inside the spare bedroom, which was decorated with the generic indifference of a hotel suite, I sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was too soft, lacking the firmness I had grown accustomed to over the years. I reached into the back of the old wooden wardrobe, pushing past the winter coats I rarely wore, and pulled out a battered tin box. It was heavy, dented on one corner, and smelled faintly of old paper and metal. In a penthouse filled with Italian leather and marble imported from overseas, this box was the only thing that truly belonged to me, in every sense of the word. I pried the lid open, and the scent of the past hit me harder than the expensive cologne drifting in from the hallway. Suddenly, I was 22 years old again, back in that small town in Ohio. I could almost feel the grease on my skin, a film that never seemed to wash off no matter how hard I scrubbed after a 12-hour shift at the diner. I was a girl who dreamed of a small house with a porch. Nothing more. Then I met Michael Hart. He was a quiet electrician with calloused hands and eyes that were always looking up at the skeletons of buildings being raised against the sky. "Eleanor," he had told me on our second date, pointing at a half-finished structure. "Bricks and mortar don't lie. You build it right, and it stands forever." We married with no fanfare and moved to this big city by the lake to start over. We rented a one-bedroom apartment that smelled perpetually of damp earth and boiled cabbage. We worked in shifts. Michael took every overtime hour he could get, often working through the night, while I cleaned office buildings before the sun came up. Every spare coin, every single dollar bill we didn't spend on bare necessities, went into a glass pickle jar on our wobbly kitchen table. We taped a piece of paper to it that read, "Our land." Lucas was born into that damp apartment. He slept in a crib we had salvaged from the local dump and repainted ourselves. He never knew that the ceiling leaked when it rained hard, or that his parents ate toast for dinner so he could have formula. It took nearly 10 years of scraping and saving, but we finally bought our first property. It was a cramped duplex in a working-class neighborhood, purchased with a patchwork of loans and savings. We did not hire contractors. Michael fixed the plumbing and rewired the electrical panel, while I learned to lay tile and patch drywall. I remembered the night I sat at the kitchen table with my self-taught ledger, realizing the potential hidden in the numbers. "Michael," I had said, my voice trembling with excitement as I pointed at the columns of figures. "Look at this. If we use the rent from the downstairs unit to cover the mortgage and save the rest, we can buy another one in 3 years." He had looked at me, a smudge of dirt on his cheek, and grinned. "You are the brains. Elle, I am just the hands." We founded the Blue Ember Habitat Group right there at that table. It was a strange name, something we came up with because Michael said the hottest part of a flame was blue. We registered it simply, and for the first 2 years, the corporate headquarters was nothing more than a wooden sign hanging on our garage door. No one back then could have known that this was the seed of an empire that would eventually span the city. I looked down at the papers in my lap. I was no longer that waitress. I was the owner of dozens of properties. Yet the people outside that door saw only an old woman in an apron. They saw a grandmother who needed charity. I picked up the deed to that first duplex, the paper yellowed and brittle. Beneath it was a photograph of Michael and me standing in front of it, covered in paint, looking exhausted but triumphant. Beside it lay the very first rent check we ever received, uncashed and framed in plastic. My vision blurred. Tears, hot and fast, spilled onto my cheeks. I was not crying for the hard times. I was not crying for the insults Lucas had just hurled at me. I was crying because I realized that in trying to protect my son from the struggle, I had crippled him. I had let him grow up believing that houses just appeared, that heat just happened, and that money was something that flowed from a tap. I ran my thumb over Michael's signature on an old contract. "Oh, Michael," I whispered, my voice breaking in the empty room. "I made a monster, didn't I?" I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The question burned in my chest, more painful than the arthritis in my joints. From when did my humility transform into a conspiracy of silence? When did I decide that lying to my son about how the world worked was an act of love? Allowing him to believe that the universe naturally fell into his lap. The next 15 years passed in a blur of drywall dust and bank deposit slips. Blue Ember Habitat Group grew from that single, cramped duplex in West Hollow into a sprawling network of rental units scattered across the city. Every single one of them had my sweat soaked into the walls and Michael's paint stains on the banisters. We were not just landlords. We were custodians of our own ambition. When the financial crisis hit and the housing market collapsed like a house of cards, the world panicked. Property values plummeted, and everyone we knew was selling off assets to stop the bleeding. Friends told us we were insane to hold on. "Eleanor, you have to sell," our neighbour had told me over the fence, his face grey with worry. "Cash out before you lose it all." But Michael and I did the opposite. We scraped together every cent of liquidity we had and bought. We bought foreclosures for pennies on the dollar, snatching up 3 flats and small apartment complexes that banks were desperate to offload. We were terrified, of course, but we held the line. Then, the silence came. Michael died instantly from an aortic rupture at the age of 52. He collapsed right there on the construction site of a 6-unit building we were renovating, wearing his work boots and holding a blueprint. The funeral was not a gathering of rich tycoons. It was a sea of working-class faces. Our tenants came by the dozens. People whose water heaters Michael had fixed at 3 a.m. People whose rent I had allowed to slide when they lost their jobs. They stood in the rain to say goodbye to the man who had given them a roof. In the weeks after, the vultures circled. Developers wanted to buy Blue Ember for parts. I sat in a cold lawyer's office, staring at the offer on the table. "It is a good price. Mrs. Hart," the lawyer said. "You can retire. Be comfortable." I looked at him, my eyes dry and hard. I am not selling Michael's sweat for a check. I decided to step into the shadows. I hired David Morales, a sharp, hungry property manager who understood our philosophy, to serve as the CEO. I restructured the company so that I retained an 82% controlling interest. But my name appeared nowhere on the public-facing documents. To the world, Blue Ember was a faceless corporation. To David, I was the boss. But to Lucas, I became a ghost. I moved us into a modest townhouse in Pilson Park, I continued to clip coupons, shop at discount grocery stores, and wear the same wool coat for 7 winters. I wanted Lucas to grow up hungry. I was terrified that if he knew we were sitting on a gold mine, he would turn into one of those entitled brats we used to rent to. Mom, everyone else has the new gaming console. Lucas would complain when he was 16. We have a budget. Lucas, I would say, chopping carrots in our small kitchen. If you want it, you earn it. And he did. He worked summers. When he got into architecture school, he did it on scholarships and student loans. He had no idea that I could have written a check for his entire tuition without blinking. I watched him struggle with debt, believing that the struggle would build his character just as it had built mine. But the seed of resentment was planted there, in the gap between his ambition and my feigned poverty. When he graduated and entered the world of high-end architecture, he saw the glimmering lives of his clients, and he wanted that. He wanted the luxury he felt he had been denied. I maintained the lie perfectly. I told him I had taken a job as a senior accountant for a mid-sized real estate firm called Blue Ember. It pays the bills. Honey? I told him over a cheap diner lunch one day. Nothing fancy, but it is steady. He never asked for details. He never asked why a simple accountant had the ear of the CEO. He just saw his mother, the widow in the sensible shoes, and looked right past her. As I sat on the floor of the guest room, holding a picture of Lucas at his graduation, the weight of my deception crushed me. I had built an empire of brick and glass, but in doing so, I had constructed a prison of lies. I had locked myself in the role of the helpless widow, and I had locked my son in a state of ignorant arrogance. And now, that ignorance had just evicted me. 3 years before that disastrous Christmas dinner, Lucas came to visit me at the small satellite office where I maintained my cover. I sat at a cramped desk in the back corner, surrounded by filing cabinets, pretending to be the loyal, long-serving accountant. Lucas slumped into the plastic visitor chair, loosening his tie. "Mom, I am drowning," he said, rubbing his temples. "My salary is decent, but the rent downtown is insane. Jason and Mark just bought condos, and here I am, living in a shoebox." I turned to my computer screen. I opened the master property list for Blue Ember Habitat Group. My eyes stopped on a line item for the Riverfront Heights building. We had just finished a massive renovation on the 35th floor. It was a 2,200 square foot loft with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. It was currently sitting empty, waiting for a tenant who could afford the $4,000 a month price tag. I fought a war inside my own head, right then and there. I should have let him struggle. I should have told him to move to the suburbs. Instead, I let the mother in me strangle the businesswoman. "Lucas," I said, turning my monitor away so he could not see the administrative privileges I had. "The company has a new program. They want a young architect to live in the new Riverfront unit. You know, to be a face for the brand. They are offering it to employees and their families for 50% of the market rate." Lucas dropped his hands from his face. His jaw actually fell open. Are you serious?" he stammered. "Mom, that building is iconic. I can pull some strings." I lied, my voice steady. "But you have to promise to take care of it." He signed the lease the next day. He was so excited about the view and the exposed brick that he did not even glance at the signature line for the landlord. If he had, he might have noticed that the authorizing signature was simply D. Morales. acting on behalf of a holding company he had never bothered to research. A few months later, Bella entered the picture. She was a content creator with perfect hair and an inability to experience a moment without filming it. She moved into the loft, and suddenly, my investment became her stage set. I watched her Instagram stories from my burner account. She would pose on the Italian leather sofa I had paid for, captioning it, "Our Sanctuary." Built with love and late nights, self-made. It made my stomach turn, but I told myself I was helping Lucas build a life, to help him maintain the image of a successful senior architect. I authorized the company to lease a brand new electric SUV for his use. I told him it was a corporate fleet vehicle that needed to be driven for tax purposes. Then, I handed him a credit card. "This is linked to my personal savings," I told him, handing over the platinum card. "It is for emergencies only. Please be careful." "Of course. Mum," he said, hugging me. "You know me. I am responsible." The definition of emergency apparently changed very quickly. The first month, the bill was reasonable. The second month, I saw a charge for $900 at a steakhouse called the Gilded Horn. Then came the charges for designer handbags, weekend spa retreats, and bottle service at clubs. I paid every single bill. I sat in my kitchen in Pilsen Park, drinking instant coffee, and paid off their $500 sushi dinners. I kept telling myself that he would realize how much it was adding up. I thought he would come to me and say he was sorry. Instead, the narrative flipped. Lucas began to believe the story he was telling his friends. He was the brilliant architect who had snagged a deal on a penthouse because of his talent. He was the one driving the luxury car because he deserved it. And I was just the poor, widowed mother he was graciously allowing to stay in the guest room during the holidays. When I tried to suggest they save money, Bella would laugh, a tinkling, dismissive sound. "Oh, Eleanor," she would say, patting my hand like I was a child. "You have to spend money to manifest money. It is a mindset thing." And when I looked to my son for support, he would just shrug. "Times are different." "Mum," he would say, checking his reflection in the window of the loft I owned, "you have to project success." I realized too late what I had done. I had built a golden throne and placed my son upon it. Then, I had knelt down and chained my own ankle to the leg of that chair. He truly believed he was the king of the castle, and he had absolutely no idea that the floor beneath his feet was held up solely by my silence. Back in the guest room, I pulled my small suitcase from under the bed. My hands were shaking as I folded my sweaters, but not because I was old. I was trembling with a cold, hard fury that had finally snapped the leash I had kept on it for years. I caught my reflection in the mirror above the dresser. I saw a woman with silver hair and wrinkles. Yes, but my spine was straight. I was not a victim. I was a titan who had forgotten her own strength. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick manila folder I always carried with me, my insurance policy against my own sentimentality. I spread the papers out on the bedspread like a general laying out a battle map. The certificate of 82% ownership of Blue Ember Habitat Group, the master list of 43 properties, the registration for the electric SUV, the credit card statements detailing 3 years of excess. I picked up my phone and dialed David Morales. It was Christmas Eve, but I knew he would answer. "Eleanor." His voice was thick with sleep and confusion. "Is everything okay, David?" I said, my voice devoid of any holiday warmth. "I need to see you tomorrow morning at 8. at the headquarters, and I am not coming as the old accountant lady. I am coming as the owner. There was a stunned silence on the other end. Of course. What is going on? I made a mistake. David, I said, looking down at the lease agreement with Lucas's signature on it. I let my son live in a fantasy. I let him think the apartment, the car, the life were all just luck and his own brilliance. I need to end the game. What do you want to do? David asked, his tone shifting to professional alertness. Process the non-renewal for the loft, I instructed, each word feeling like I was pulling a tooth. The lease is up on the 1st. Do not offer an extension. Recall the company vehicle. Cancel the supplementary credit card. Effective immediately. Treat him exactly like any other tenant who violated the terms of respect. Eleanor. David hesitated. This is extreme. It is Christmas. He told me to pay rent or get out. David, I whispered, a tear finally escaping. He told his own mother to get out. I hung up. I sat there for a moment, the silence of the room pressing against my ears. Was I doing this out of love, or was I doing it out of spite? I closed my eyes and saw Lucas as a feverish toddler, sleeping on my chest in that drafty duplex, his small hand clutching my shirt. I loved that boy more than my own life. But the man out there in the dining room, the man who humiliated me to impress his friends, that man was a stranger. If I stayed silent, if I paid his rent, I was not loving him. I was financing his cruelty. I was helping him become a monster. Love without boundaries was just a sickness. I finished packing. I put the keys to my townhouse in Pilsen Park, my real home, the one Lucas had never bothered to visit, into my purse. I opened the Uber app on my phone and ordered a car. I walked out of the bedroom, the wheels of my suitcase humming on the hardwood floor. The dinner party had quieted down, the guests now lounging with their drinks. When I entered the dining room, heads turned. Bella looked at the suitcase and let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Oh, Eleanor, do not be so dramatic, she said, swirling her wine. You are not actually leaving on Christmas Eve. Lucas stood up, looking flustered. Mom, come on. Sit down. We can talk about the rent later. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the last time as his enabler. You said you wanted the adults to share the costs, I said, my voice calm and terrifyingly level. I agree. Starting tomorrow, everything will be calculated like adults. I didn't wait for a response. I walked to the private elevator that opened directly into the penthouse foyer, a feature I had approved in the blueprints 5 years ago. I pressed the button. Mom. Wait, Lucas called out, taking a step forward. The doors slid open. I stepped inside and turned to face them. The festive lights of the Christmas tree reflected in the glass, distorting their shocked faces. You just evicted me from my own house. Lucas? I thought as the doors began to close. Now let us see how you live when the house evicts you. The doors shut with a final, heavy thud. I was alone in the descending car, plummeting 35 floors down to the street, leaving my son on top of the world one last time before I pulled the ground out from under him. The next morning, the hangover from the night before hit Lucas, but the real headache arrived at 9 in the morning via email. I was not there to see it, but the digital logs told the story. He opened a notification from the Blue Ember management system. The subject line was stark and unfeeling. Notice of lease non-renewal. He called the office immediately, his voice tight with panic. He was convinced it was a clerical error, a glitch in the system. The property manager who answered followed my instructions to the letter. There is no mistake. Mr. Hart, she told him. The owner is exercising the right to terminate the at-will agreement. The new market rate for that unit is $8,000 a month. You are welcome to reapply. Lucas did not just call. He ran. He drove that electric SUV straight to the Blue Ember headquarters. For the first time in his life, he actually looked at the building where he thought I simply shuffled papers. He was escorted up to the executive suite, a glass-walled room overlooking the river. On the wall hung a large, black and white photograph of a man in a hard hat, smiling through a layer of dust. It was his father. Michael. David Morales sat behind the desk. He did not offer Lucas a seat. The preferential lease has expired. Lucas, David said, his voice professional and cold. The company is restructuring its assets. You can stay, of course, but you will pay 3 times what you were paying before, plus the security deposit. But who is making these decisions? Lucas demanded, slamming his hand on the desk. I want to speak to the owner. I bet they do not even know who I am. David leaned back, his face unreadable. Oh, the owner knows exactly who you are. As for the identity, Blue Ember is a limited liability company. The shareholder structure is private. Lucas stormed out, realizing with a jolt that he had never once asked me who actually signed my paychecks. Across town, the humiliation was taking a different form. Bella was standing at the counter of a high-end boutique, surrounded by a pile of silk garments. She handed over the platinum card, the one she used to buy clout. I am sorry, ma'am, the cashier said loud enough for the line behind her to hear. This card has been declined. Try it again. Bella snapped, her face flushing red. It is a platinum card. I did, the cashier replied, handing the plastic back like it was contaminated. The account was closed this morning by the primary cardholder, Eleanor Hart. Bella stood there, frozen, while the women behind her whispered and checked their phones. By evening, the dismantling of their lives was physical. A recovery team from Blue Ember arrived at the penthouse garage. They presented paperwork for the immediate return of the company vehicle. Lucas tried to argue, waving the keys in the air. This is my car, he shouted. It is part of my compensation package. The repo agent simply held up the contract Lucas had signed 3 years ago without reading. It says right here, Mr. Hart. Vehicle provided for temporary use at the sole discretion of the company owner. That discretion has been revoked. They took the keys. Lucas and Bella were left standing in the garage, the empty space where the SUV used to be screaming at them. The fight that followed was explosive. Bella accused me of being petty. Lucas called my phone a dozen times, leaving voicemails that swung from anger to begging. I listened to none of them, desperate for answers. Lucas finally did what he should have done a decade ago. He sat down at his computer and typed Blue Ember Habitat Group into the search bar. He scrolled past the rental listings and found the archived business articles. Local couple Michael and Eleanor Hart revolutionize affordable housing. From West Hollow to the skyline. The Hart family empire. He stared at the screen. He saw his father's name listed as co-founder. He saw my name listed as majority shareholder. He drove a rental car out to the suburbs to see his Aunt Marlene, Michael's younger sister. She opened the door, and the moment she saw his face, she burst into tears. Under his questioning, She broke the 20-year silence. They did it for you. Lucas. She sobbed, wringing her hands. Your mother. She wanted you to make your own way. She owns it all. The apartments, the commercial lots, everything. Lucas sat on her floral sofa, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with a sickening thud. The company was his father's legacy. The loft was his mother's property. The card was her money. The car was her generosity. He realized then, with a nausea that buckled his knees, that he had not just kicked an old lady out of his dining room. He had looked the owner of his entire world in the eye and told her she did not belong in the house she had built. And now, he was the one standing in the cold, without the safety net of my bank account to catch him. Lucas fell hard, and the landing was not graceful. He could not afford the new market rate at Riverfront Heights, obviously, so he packed his life into cardboard boxes. The $1 million view vanished from Bella's social media feed, replaced by a silence that was louder than any complaint. He found an apartment in a neighborhood called Maple Row. It was a stark contrast to the glass tower he had just left. The building was old, the elevator was permanently out of order, and the hallway smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial-strength lemon cleaner. The rent was exactly half of his actual take-home pay. Bella came to see it only once. She stood in the doorway in her designer heels, looking at the peeling paint on the baseboards and the slightly crooked doorframe. "Lucas," she said, her voice trembling with genuine horror. I cannot live here. Look at this place. It smells like failure. It is what I can afford." "Bella," Lucas replied, his voice tired. "If we budget, we can... She laughed, a harsh sound. "I am going to my parents' house in Florida. Call me when you fix this." She left him there with 2 suitcases of clothes and a few pieces of cheap furniture he had bought at a discount store. That night, Lucas learned what it meant to be truly alone. There were no movers to assemble his bed. There was no concierge to bring up his packages. He dragged a mattress up 3 flights of stairs, sweating and cursing, and spent 4 hours trying to decipher instructions for a particle board dresser. For the first time, he sat down with a notebook and calculated the cost of electricity, internet, and bus fare. The numbers were terrifyingly real. He slowly grew accustomed to the rhythm of the building. The walls were thin, and he learned the intimate details of his neighbors' lives. There was a young couple next door who argued softly about grocery bills late at night. There was a man upstairs who played the guitar with surprising skill. And downstairs, there was Ruth, a 70-year-old widow who watched game shows at top volume every evening. One evening, Ruth knocked on his door holding a foil-covered dish. "I made too much lasagna," she said, peering into his sparse apartment. "You look like you need a hot meal. Where is your wife?" Lucas took the plate, his face flushing. "She is taking some time away." Ruth chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. "Do not worry, honey. Money runs out. People run out. When the money comes back, the people come back. The important thing is who you become in the meantime." Lucas started taking the bus to work. He stood at the stop at 6 a.m, shivering in the grey light, surrounded by people carrying lunch pails and thermoses. He watched nurses, construction workers, and cleaners checking their watches, tired before the day had even begun. From the leather seat of his SUV, he had never seen them. Now, he was one of them. At his architecture firm, the atmosphere had shifted. The admiration was gone, replaced by hushed whispers. Bella had posted a cryptic video online about a wealthy mother-in-law cutting off a struggling young couple, and the rumor mill was churning. I heard his mum paid for everything, a junior associate whispered near the water cooler, not knowing Lucas was around the corner. Kind of pathetic. At his age. Lucas kept his head down. He threw himself into his work during the day and picked up freelance drafting jobs at night. He stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning in that cramped apartment, his eyes burning as he drew plans for other people's dream homes while eating instant noodles. Then came the night the pipe burst. A water line in the ceiling gave way, dripping dirty water onto his only rug. The landlord, a stressed man in a faded polo shirt, came over with a bucket and a wrench. "I am sorry, Lucas," the landlord said, wiping his forehead. "I can patch it. But I do not have the $3,000 to replace the old system right now. We just have to make do." Lucas looked at the soggy ceiling and the tired man trying to fix it. For the first time, he thought about the hundreds of maintenance requests Blue Ember handled every month. He realized that a leaking roof was not just an inconvenience. For people like his landlord and his neighbors, it was a financial catastrophe. He sat on his wet floor, feeling the damp cold seep into his bones, and understood exactly why I had worked so hard to keep the water out of his life. But now, the dam had broken, and he was finally learning how to swim. In my small red brick house in Pilsen Park, I settled back into the rhythm of a life I had never truly left. I brewed cheap instant coffee in the mornings, the kind that tasted slightly metallic, and walked to the farmer's market to haggle over bruised tomatoes. Then, I would sit at my chipped wooden kitchen table, reviewing the financial reports for Blue Ember Habitat Group. It was a quiet life, but the silence was heavy. Every time I walked past the spare bedroom, the one I had painted yellow years ago, hoping for a grandchild that never came, I felt a pang in my chest that no amount of business success could fix. David Morales called me on Tuesday with the final update on the separation. "It is done. Eleanor," he said, his voice professional, but soft. "Lucas vacated the loft on Sunday. We listed it Monday morning, and it was leased by Tuesday afternoon at full market rate. The demand for that view is aggressive." "And the car?" I asked, staring at a crack in my kitchen wall. "Repurposed for the site managers at the West Side project." David replied. "As for the credit card debt, the final balance was $12,000. I paid it from your personal dividends as instructed." "Good," I said, though it felt anything but good. "That is good." Sleep became a stranger to me. At night, I would lie awake, the streetlights casting long shadows across my ceiling. I found myself scrolling through the photo gallery on my phone, looking at the ghosts of who we used to be. There was Lucas at 6 years old, standing on an overturned paint bucket, grinning with a smudge of blue primer on his nose. There was Lucas at graduation, holding his degree like a weapon against poverty. And there was Lucas at his wedding, whispering to me during the dance, "I will always take care of you. Mum," he had said, "you won't have to worry about a thing." My phone would buzz on the nightstand, Lucas calling. Then a text. "Mom, please pick up." Then another. "I am sorry. Please." I never answered. I let the screen go dark every single time. It was not because I hated him. It was because I knew that if I heard his voice, if I heard that specific crack in his tone that he used when he was hurting, I would crumble. I would write a check, fix his problem, and ruin him forever. At the office, I tried to distract myself. During a strategy meeting, a group of young associates presented a plan for converting old warehouses into budget-friendly micro-apartments. It was a decent idea, but their designs lacked soul. They were efficient, but cold. I sat at the head of the table, listening to them talk about maximizing density, and all I could think of was Lucas's sketches from college, where he always prioritized natural light because he remembered how dark our first apartment was. After the meeting, I met with my personal attorney. I want to restructure the estate, I told him, sliding a folder across the mahogany desk. The bulk of the assets will go into a new trust, the Hart Foundation for Honest Housing. It will fund affordable living projects. The lawyer pushed his glasses up his nose. And your son? He gets a small stipend, I said, my voice steady. But access to the main capital, no, unless he can prove to the board that he has the character to manage it. A week later, I drove past a renovation site Blue Ember was managing in the garment district. I parked my sedan behind a delivery truck and watched. In the distance, amidst the dust and noise, I saw him. Lucas was there. He was not wearing his Italian suit. He was wearing jeans and a yellow hard hat that looked dusty. He was pointing at a structural beam, arguing with a burly contractor. I rolled down the window to hear, "You cannot cut that corner." Mike Lucas was shouting, waving a roll of blueprints. "If we use the cheaper timber, the load-bearing capacity drops by 15%. People are going to live here." I watched him wipe sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve. He looked tired. He looked thinner. But for the first time in his life, he looked like a builder, not just an owner. Later that afternoon, David stopped by my office. "Your son is requesting transfers," David said, leaning against the doorframe. "He is asking to be put on the renovation crews for the older buildings." He stopped pitching for the skyscrapers. He says he wants to learn how to fix the bones of a place. I nodded, keeping my eyes on my paperwork so David would not see the moisture gathering in them. Let him. But no special treatment that night back in Pilsen Park. I opened my journal. I wrote a single entry, "He is learning," not from my lectures, but from the cold concrete. Maybe it is time to give him a chance, but not a free one. Just as I was closing the book, my email pinged. It was a notification from our blind investment portal, the one we used to screen anonymous proposals for the new foundation. I opened the attachment. It was a proposal for a project called the Second Chance Initiative Dignified Housing for the Displaced. The author listed on the title page was simply Lucas Hart, architect. I stared at the screen, and a small, genuine smile touched my lips for the first time since Christmas. The curtain was falling on the tragedy, and the next act was about to begin. The invitation arrived in Lucas's inbox on a Tuesday morning under the letterhead of the Aurora Civic Fund. It was a social investment group he had never heard of, likely because I had established it only 2 months prior as a quiet arm of Blue Ember. The email invited him to present his proposal for the warehouse conversion project. He had no idea that the hand extending this lifeline was the same one that had cut his credit cards. For 3 weeks, Lucas disappeared into his work. He did not design for magazines this time. He designed for survival. He drafted plans for units ranging from 480 to 520 square feet. He prioritized natural light, not for aesthetics, but to lower electricity bills. He specified recycled insulation and kept the existing brickwork to keep costs down. Every dimension in that plan was informed by the cramped reality of his apartment in Maple Row. On the day of the presentation, Lucas walked into the conference room on the 20th floor of a downtown high-rise. He looked nervous. His suit was pressed but slightly worn, a stark difference from the bespoke tailoring he used to flaunt. He shook hands with the 4 board members present. Then, his eyes landed on the man sitting at the far end of the table. David Lucas whispered, the color draining from his face. "I mean, Mr. Morales." David nodded once, his face impassive. "Please begin." "Mr. Hart." Lucas swallowed hard, but he did not run. He set up his slides. He spoke for 20 minutes without a single buzzword. He talked about thermal efficiency and community spaces. He talked about the humiliation of a leaking ceiling and the fear of an eviction notice. "We can offer these units at 20% below the market median," Lucas said, his voice gaining strength. "By keeping the finishes simple and durable, we reduce maintenance costs. It is not luxury, it is dignity." The board members, acting on my instructions to be ruthless, attacked immediately. "The profit margins are razor thin," one member noted, tapping a pen on the table. "Why should we invest in this when we could flip the building for a 40% return? What happens if the market shifts?" Lucas fielded every question. He admitted the risks. He did not promise the moon. He promised stability. Then, the double doors at the back of the room opened. I walked in. I was wearing a dark navy suit with my hair pulled back in a tight bun. I did not look like the grandmother who baked turkeys. I looked like the woman who owned 43 buildings in this city. I walked past Lucas, who stood frozen by the projector screen, his mouth slightly open. I took the empty seat at the head of the table. "Madame Chairwoman," David said, acknowledging me. Lucas looked like he had been struck by lightning. He stared at me, realizing for the first time that I was not just a silent partner. I was the architect of the entire room. "Mr. Hart," I said, my voice cutting through the air like glass. "Thank you for the presentation." "Mom," he breathed, the word barely audible. You are Aurora. I am the chair of the board." I corrected him. "And I have a question." I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the table. "You talk a lot about community and dignity," I said. "But 3 years ago, you treated a home as a backdrop for social media. You treated money as a toy. So, why should we trust you? Why should we believe you will not turn this project into an ego trip and abandon these tenants the moment things get difficult?" The room went deadly quiet. Lucas looked down at his hands. I saw him tremble, just once. When he looked up, his eyes were clear. There were no tears. "Because I know what it feels like to fall," Lucas said softly. "I lost my car. I lost my credit. My wife left me because she could not stand the smell of cheap cleaner in our hallway. I spent the last year counting every dollar for bus fare." He took a breath, his voice shaking with the effort to keep it steady. "I used to think a house was something you showed off." He continued, "But when the pipe burst in my apartment last month, and I sat there with a bucket, I realized a house is the only thing keeping the world out. I am not asking for this money because my mother is Eleanor Hart. I am asking because I want to build the safety net I took for granted. If you say no, I will find another way. It will just take me 10 years longer." He stopped. He did not beg. He stood his ground. I looked at the board members. They were silent. I looked at David, who gave me a microscopic nod. I picked up the pen. "The margins are tight," I said, signing the bottom of the approval sheet. But the social impact is acceptable. I slid the paper toward David. The Aurora Civic Fund approves the seed capital. I announced, standing up, on 2 conditions. 1. You report monthly directly to this board. And 2. If I see a single photo of this project used to promote your personal brand, I will pull the funding so fast your head will spin. Lucas stared at the signature on the paper. He looked at me, and for the first time in 20 years, he did not see a checkbook. He saw a boss. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I will not let you down. See that you don't," I replied, turning to leave before he could see the pride threatening to crack my composure. It was exactly 1 year later when I finally sent the text. I sat in my kitchen in Pilsen Park, the snow falling softly outside the small window, and typed the message. Dinner on the 24th. If you are free, come to the house in Pilsen. Bring yourself. Do not bring your pride. It was the first time I had reached out to him since the elevator doors closed on his old life. Lucas arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. He was holding a baking tray with a slightly lopsided chocolate cake. He looked different. The arrogance that used to puff out his chest was gone, replaced by a quiet caution. My house was not like the penthouse. It had exposed brick that was structural, not decorative. The tree was small and real, smelling of pine needles. The table was old oak, scarred from years of use. Around the table sat a strange mix of people. There was David Morales, unbuttoning his suit jacket. There was Ruth, the widow from Lucas's apartment building in Maple Row. There were 2 tenants from the new Aurora project. It was intimate, but the air was thick with unspoken history. Lucas set the cake down. I think I burnt the edges a little," he said, his voice tight. "It adds character," I replied, handing him an apron. As we ate, the conversation flowed around him. A middle-aged woman named Sarah spoke about the unit she had just moved into. "It is the first time in 5 years I do not have to worry about the roof leaking when it storms," she said, tearing a piece of bread. "I can finally sleep." A young man next to her nodded. "The rent is low enough that I can save for trade school. I am going to be an electrician." Lucas listened, his eyes moving from the guests to the photos on my wall. He stared at the picture of Michael, his father, standing in front of our first duplex. Then he looked at a grainy photo of himself as a boy, holding a plastic tool set in an empty room. When the plates were cleared, I stood up. I tapped my glass with a spoon. The room went quiet. "I have something to say," I announced, my hands resting on the back of my chair, especially to Lucas. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a thick envelope containing copies of the Blue Ember share certificates. I placed it in the center of the table. "Lucas," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "you once evicted me from the apartment I bought. I responded by evicting you from the fake world you created. That is the truth. But it was also the first time in my life that I treated you like a man instead of a child." Lucas did not look away. He did not argue. He stood up slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "You were right," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I treated that loft like a trophy. I let myself spend money that wasn't mine. I never once asked you how you were living. I just took." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a white envelope. He slid it across the table toward me. This is a breakdown of every dollar I charged to that credit card, he said, and a payment plan. Payment? I am putting 20% of my salary from the Aurora project into the foundation every month. I cannot pay it all back right now, but I will pay it back, even if it takes the rest of my life. The room was silent. I looked at the repayment plan. I looked at the shares. Then, I picked up his envelope. I walked over to the fireplace where a small log was crackling. I tossed the envelope into the flames. "Mum," Lucas gasped. "That was I do not need your money." "Lucas," I said, watching the paper curl and blacken, "I need you to understand. And after this past year, I believe you do. From today on, I am not the unpaid maid in the penthouse. I am Eleanor Hart. I am the woman who poured her life into these walls, and I am your mother." I picked up the envelope I had placed on the table and handed it to him. "This is a transfer for 10% of the non-voting shares of Blue Ember," I told him. "It is not a gift. It is a responsibility. I want you to lead the social development wing, officially, under the supervision of the board." Lucas took the envelope. He looked at me, and then he hugged me. It was not the hug of a boy wanting a favor. It was the hug of a man offering respect. We ended the night in the small kitchen, washing dishes side by side. The soap suds were warm on my hands. There were no lies left between us, just the clinking of plates and the hum of the refrigerator. My revenge was complete, not because I had destroyed him, but because I had finally saved him. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you guys are tuning in from, so drop your city or country in the comments below so we can say hi. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, smash that like button, and hit the hype button to help this video reach even more people. See you in the next one.